Sometimes the most terrifying crimes aren't committed in this world, but within our own minds. This story began when Detective Evan Bradley thought he'd found his last case. It ended when he finally understood the truth about himself. Chapter 1. The Last Call. Evan Bradley stood by the window of his tiny office, watching the rain blur the streetlights on the empty road below. Autumn had draped the city in a heavy, viscous chill that seeped into his bones. On his desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, his faithful companion these past few years, sat amidst a clutter of old papers and dusty files. A cigarette smoldered between his fingers, its acrid smoke slowly absorbing into the faded wallpaper, long past its prime. Once, Evan had been a respected detective, his name spoken with reverence throughout the city. Colleagues valued his sharp insight, superiors his impeccable case-solving record. But those days were long gone. All that remained were scars, deep, aching wounds on his body, and even deeper, invisible ones on his soul. He'd been suspended from the police force after a scandal that had swept through the city like a wildfire, whispered about for months. Rumors multiplied, growing into wild tales. Some claimed Evan had cold-bloodedly framed his partner for money. Others insisted he'd snapped during an arrest and mercilessly shot an innocent man. The truth, as often happens, lay somewhere in between, hidden behind a veil of half-truths and distorted facts. And that truth, bitter and relentless, stared back at him from the mirror every day, a stark reminder of his fall. Evan had long since given up on changing anything in his life. His days dragged on, mundane and boring, filled with routine, ordinary cases that only highlighted his current insignificance. Wives spying on husbands, husbands on wives, small shop owners asking him to find stolen junk. He was a shadow of his former self, and he'd accepted it. But that night, everything changed. The office door creaked open with a sharp, piercing sound, breaking the thick silence of the room. A woman stood in the doorway. She looked to be in her 60s, dressed in an old, worn gray coat that seemed to have seen better days, and a veiled hat that hid part of her face. Even through the sheer fabric, it was clear her face was pale, gaunt, as if she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes glimmered with unshed tears, barely held back, ready to spill at any moment. "Mr. Bradley?" Her voice trembled, betraying deep distress. "They told me you might be able to help." Evan slowly extinguished his cigarette in the overflowing ashtray, leaving a thin wisp of smoke. He gave the woman a long, penetrating look, instinctively assessing her as he would a witness in a case. "Depends on what it is, lady," he rasped, trying to keep his voice professional despite his weariness. "My granddaughter, Sarah, she's gone," the woman began, the words coming with difficulty. "She disappeared last night. The police say she ran away, but I know that's not true. I feel it. Someone took her." With trembling hands, she handed him an old, crumpled photograph. It showed a small girl, about 9 years old, with long, light brown hair framing her thin face, and enormous, sad eyes that seemed to look right into his soul. Evan felt as if the girl's gaze, full of unspoken sorrow, pierced him to the core, stirring long-forgotten emotions. He took the photo, feeling its weight in his hand, and looked at the woman again. "Where do you live?" "On St. James Road." "House 27. Evan nodded, processing the information. He knew the area, an old, forgotten part of town, full of dilapidated houses and crumbling streets. "All right, I'll come by in the morning," he said, though he knew deep down he couldn't wait until then. "You should get some rest." But he knew waiting wasn't for him. A premonition, long dormant, stirred within him. This wasn't just another missing property case. This was something else, something that demanded immediate attention. And Evan, to his surprise, felt a surge of long-forgotten energy, like an old hunting dog catching a scent. Chapter 2. The House of Shadows. The Scots house stood isolated, as if deliberately turning its back on the rest of the city, unwilling to be a part of it. It was located on the outskirts of St. James Road, where narrow streets gave way to unpaved dirt roads that vanished into a thick fog. It was an old brick building, its walls peeling and covered in ingrained grime, and a leaning fence that looked ready to collapse at any moment under the wind's assault. The garden, once perhaps well-tended, was now overgrown with weeds and dry grass, creating a sense of utter desolation. As Evan approached the house, he thought he saw a shadow flicker behind a curtained window. But perhaps it was just a trick of the light, an illusion caused by fatigue. Mary opened the door, and the creak of the hinges cut through the night's silence. Inside, the house smelled of dust, age, and dampness, as if no one had lived there for a long time. The air was heavy, oppressive. The house was cold, like a tomb, despite the approaching dawn outside. Evan slowly walked through the rooms, examining every corner with professional attention. The kitchen was clean but empty, as if it hadn't been used in days. The living room, cluttered with old furniture, seemed uninhabited. Then he entered Sarah's room. Everything was in its place. A neatly made bed with a worn sheet, a one-eyed teddy bear on the floor as if it had been hugged countless times. On the walls hung children's drawings, bright and naive at first glance. But as he looked closer, Evan felt a chill run down his spine. The drawings were not typical childish doodles. One depicted a tall, dark figure in a mask, standing outside the window, like an unwelcome guest watching from the darkness. Another showed enormous, empty eyes glowing in the night, like the eyes of some predator. A third depicted a house, similar to the one he was in, enveloped in an ominous shadow. "Did she draw all this?" Evan asked, turning to Mary. He noticed her lips tremble and her eyes fill with pain. The woman nodded, sighing heavily. "She was often afraid of the nights," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She said someone was watching her through the glass. That someone was waiting for her." Evan felt the chill run down his spine again. He stepped outside, taking out the flashlight he always carried. He lit up the grass, then the ground around the house. No tracks, not the slightest boot print or anything else that could indicate a stranger's presence. Only the wind rustled the dry grass stalks, creating an illusion of movement. He walked around the perimeter of the house, carefully examining every bush, every tree. In the darkness, he heard a barely discernible rustle, as if someone was moving in the bushes. Evan turned sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for the holster where a gun once sat. No one, only silence. Or so he thought. Chapter 3. Footprints in the dark. The next morning, Evan went to the police station. Heavy, leaden clouds hung over the city, reflecting his own mood. He entered the familiar building, which had once been his second home, and felt like a stranger. The duty officer, an old acquaintance of Evan's named Gary, listened to his story with a tired face and little interest. Gary had long since grown accustomed to the eccentricities of former colleagues and their conspiracy theories. "Bradley, come on," Gary said, rubbing his eyes wearily. "The girl just ran away. It happens. Teenagers often do that, especially if they're not getting enough attention." "Parents?" Evan persisted. He felt that something was off, that Gary's story didn't align with what he'd seen. "You know Mary doesn't have anyone. She lives alone," Gary replied, shrugging. "She made up a granddaughter to feel less lonely." "Old people, they often fantasize to fill the emptiness in their lives. We checked, Evan. She doesn't have a granddaughter. Never did. Nobody by that name." Evan left the station with a heavy heart. Everything inside him screamed that the girl existed. Her huge, sad eyes in the photograph couldn't be a figment of someone's sick imagination. He felt her presence, her fear, which permeated the drawings. He started questioning neighbors, trying to find any leads. Most of them just shook their heads, waving him off like an annoying fly. Some said they had seen a girl, pale, quiet, sometimes playing in the yard. Others, on the contrary, swore they had never seen any children living in the Scots house. People seemed unwilling to tell the truth, either afraid or simply ignorant of it. Or, worse yet, they had been told to keep silent. Late that evening, as the city plunged into deep silence, broken only by the sound of rain, Evan reviewed the footage from street cameras located near the Scots house. He rewound frame by frame, hour by hour, until he finally spotted what he was looking for in one of the recordings: a barely discernible silhouette of a man in a black jacket and hood. He was holding a small girl's hand, and from her gait, it was clear she was walking reluctantly, as if being dragged. They were heading towards the forest on the outskirts of the city, where the roads disappeared into the dense thicket. Evan's heart beat faster. He wasn't crazy. The girl existed, and someone had taken her. Chapter 4. The Abandoned Cabin. Evan followed them, guided by his instinct. The forest greeted him with silence and a penetrating cold that seeped under his clothes. Wet tree branches lashed at his face, leaving icy streaks on his skin. Fog clung to the ground, making it slippery and muddy, complicating every step. He pressed on, ignoring the pain in his legs and his exhaustion, until he finally came upon an old, dilapidated cabin, barely visible in the mist. Its walls were covered in a thick layer of moss, and the door hung on a single hinge, threatening to fall off at any moment. He slowly stepped inside, feeling his heart clench with foreboding. On the floor lay pieces of rotten wood, scraps of old, moldy clothing. In a corner, beneath a layer of dust, stood an old, tarnished mirror. Evan raised his flashlight, directing the beam onto its surface. In the reflection, besides himself, he saw a small girl standing directly behind him. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear. He spun around abruptly, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun that had long been absent from his holster. No one, only silence. He crouched down, trying to catch his breath. His heart pounded so hard that the thrumming in his ears drowned out all other sounds. "You're losing your mind, Bradley," he whispered to himself, trying to stop the trembling in his hands. "All your old traumas are coming back. It's just exhaustion." But he couldn't believe it. The girl's image had been too clear, too real. Chapter 5. Ghost Town. He returned to the city at dawn, just as the first rays of sun barely pierced through the thick clouds. The streets were empty. No people, no cars, not the slightest sign of life. Stores, cafes, pharmacies, everything was closed. In the windows of houses, where lights usually shone and voices were heard, there was only emptiness, as if the people had vanished without a trace. The city seemed dead, frozen in time, like a set from some eerie film. Evan went into cafes, stores, pharmacies. Not a soul anywhere. He called phone numbers he knew by heart. Rings, then silence. No one answered. He shouted, his voice echoing through the empty streets. But no one responded. He was utterly alone. And that night he heard footsteps behind his apartment wall again. Footsteps that grew louder and more insistent. Calls with empty voices that sounded like whispers from another world. And he saw those strange symbols on the walls again. Circles, crosses, triangles, drawn in blood or something resembling it. Symbols he'd already seen in the cabin, on the walls of the Scots house. They haunted him, seeping into his consciousness like a key to an unsolved mystery. Chapter 6. A Descent into the Abyss. On the 5th day, Evan returned to the Scots house. He couldn't fight it anymore. The intrusive thoughts, the guilt that gnawed at him from within. He felt he had to get to the truth, no matter how terrifying. In Sarah's room, among the children's toys, he found an old, worn-out doll. The doll was stuffed with something hard. Evan tore it open. Inside was a note, folded into quarters. He unfolded it with trembling hands. On the yellowed paper it read, "Who are you looking for, Evan?" And then fragments of memory, long buried under layers of oblivion and pain, flooded into his mind like a destructive wave, headlights blinding him. A little girl in the road, running out of the darkness, his scream full of horror, the impact, a dull, terrifying sound, the silence that followed, blood on the asphalt. He remembered it. He had never forgotten it. He understood. The girl existed. But it wasn't Sarah. It was a different girl, whose name he couldn't recall. He had hit her with his car. It had happened years ago, on that fateful night after which his life crumbled. And his mind, unwilling to accept this terrible truth, had created Sarah, the perfect victim he could endlessly search for, trapped in a never-ending loop. He created her to avoid seeing the truth, to escape his own crime, to avoid admitting his guilt. All these years, he had been living in his own nightmare, created by his own mind. Chapter 7. The Last Visitor. In the morning, he stood outside the Scott's house. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray, as if reflecting his state of mind. A police car pulled up. Officer Gary stepped out. He looked at Evan with a sadness, an uncharacteristic softness. "Bradley," Gary said, his voice quiet, almost sympathetic. "It's time. No one has lived here for a long time, and you know that. This house has been abandoned for years." Evan looked at the house, at the empty, dark windows, which now seemed to him not just empty, but lifeless. He looked at the ghost town, which suddenly made sense. It was merely a projection of his own broken mind. And for the first time in many years, he felt it. He was alone, utterly alone, in this empty, fabricated world he had created for himself. Sometimes the most terrifying crimes aren't committed in this world, but within our own minds. Crimes we commit against ourselves, trying to escape the truth. And only when we accept it, however bitter it may be, can we finally find peace.